Now, each new mega poll seems to give Labour an even bigger majority, with the Tories reduced to a rump of various sizes, but always a rump nevertheless. Famous Tory names are predicted to hit the dirt, with even the Tory Telegraph splashing this morning with the banner headline, Tory Wipeout, and a poll that says 75% of the Cabinet could lose their seats. Grant Shapps, Jeremy Hunt, Penny Mordaunt, James Cleverly, possibly gone. Well-known non-cabinet politicians like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Liz Truss, dispatched. Even Rishi Sunak could be a casualty. I rather doubt that, but he would be, maybe it would be convenient, a convenient exit for him from British politics for a man that I doubt will have much stomach for the fray after this bruising election. We'll see on the night. There might not be as many Portillo moments as the polls predict, but there will certainly be enough to justify staying up to watch, even if the eventual result is a foregone conclusion. Now, you could be forgiven from all this for concluding that the country is on the brink of a massive lurch to the left, on a par with the Labour landslide of 1945, which ushered in a radical socialist government. But we're not. It's one of the curiosities of the 2024 election that Labour is heading for probably its biggest ever majority, even though there's no great appetite for a major swing to the left. Change? Yes. Left-wing change? Not really. I think that's because it's the Tories folks are fed up with rather than Tory policies. Now, of course, there's lots of policy stuff they don't like, especially public services, fraying at the edges, or even rotting at the core. But it's above all personal. It's the Tories they're scunnered with, to use a good old Scottish word. You can see that with a number of big Tory names now at risk, and you could hear it on yesterday's radio phone-in with the Prime Minister as voter after voter called in to give him a thumping. It was actually rather unpleasant. But it's also an insurmountable problem for the Tories. After all, if you don't like a party's policies, if they're unpopular, the party can change them. But you can't change who you are. You're lumbered with that. And I think that explains not just the Labour lead, but why it's been so consistent for such a long time. There's simply nothing the Tories can do about it. The wiser heads around Keir Starmer have realised this, hence the lack of red meat in the Labour manifesto, much to the consternation of its activists and its cheerleaders in the media. Labour says it will be as tough as the Tories on getting immigration down, if not tougher. It won't raise the taxes of working people, however you define them. Indeed, bar a few tiny rises, it won't raise taxes at all, it says. It won't even trigger a massive splurge in public spending, no matter how popular that would be among its core votes, because it wants to pose as more fiscally responsible than the Conservatives. So Labour is hardly being swept to power on a left-wing prospectus. The national mood mitigates against it. Instead, Labour is betting everything on growth. Instead of socialism building the New Jerusalem, it will be economic growth, the all-purpose solution to the myriad problems that will come Labour's way. Of course, it puts a premium on Labour knowing how to generate this growth, a matter in which Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have been at their most unconvincing throughout the campaign. That doesn't matter at the moment, not when the prevailing national sentiment is simply to junk the Tories because they don't like them. But it will matter if and when Labour takes over. So much so that it is by far the biggest issue on which Labour now needs to have its feet held to the fire. This is Andrew Neil on Times Radio, your election station. Now, just when you thought it couldn't get any worse for the Tories, they were rocked last night by a triple whammy of mega polls, all of which were apocalyptic for the government, though some more so than others. The more uncommon had the Tories reduced to a rump of 125 MPs. It's pretty bad. But YouGov had them at only 108. That's a disaster. But Savanta, gloomiest of all, had them at a mere 53 MPs after July the 4th, which would make, I guess, the Lib Dems the official opposition. Savanta also has Rishi Sunak, the first Prime Minister ever to lose his seat in an election. I'd advise a stiff drink for the PM, except he's teetotal. Naturally, all these polls have Labour with a cracking historic majority. Let's talk to Patrick English, pollster, director of political analytics at YouGov. Patrick, what I'm calling mega polls are referred to as MRP polls. What does that mean, and how do they differ from traditional polling?
Good afternoon, Andrew. Yes, as you correctly point out, the three big polls that were released yesterday are MRP polls. Now, that stands for multi-level regression and post-stratification, which I appreciate gives no further indication as to what they actually are. But very briefly, what it is these are polls which take a huge amount of sample information, minimum sort of around 10, 20,000 people. Here at YouGov, we tend to use between 40 and 60,000 people for our election MRPs. It asks them how they would vote. It matches that to information that we know about them, such as how they voted last time, their social demographic backgrounds, and where they live. And it uses all of that in a statistical model to try and understand how all the different types of voters in all the different types of constituencies are likely to vote. And from there, we can make a projection as to who's winning in each constituency and therefore who is winning the election.
Right. Well, given all that, seems a lot of work, more work than the traditional poll, more expansive, bigger than the traditional polls. Should we regard them as more reliable?
It certainly takes an awful lot of time, an awful lot of computing power, an awful lot of brain power to put these together. In 2017, YouGov became the first company to use MRP to do a public projection of an election, and it correctly anticipated that Theresa May would lose her majority and that we would have a hung parliament, which
Interesting.
was very much contrary to expectations at the time, indeed.
Hmm.
So we're very proud to have used it in the 2019 election, got that one right. We used it in Spain in 2023, and that came out very well as well. So we're confident in the method, we're confident in its ability to understand how different areas are going to vote, which, as we know in British elections, is the key story. It's not really about so much how many votes you have, it's how many constituencies you win. And MRP allows us to get a really strong insight into what's happening at the constituency level.
Should we not be a bit suspicious, though, that although they're obviously they're unanimously bad, these three for the Tories, but they're bad to very bad to terribly bad in different degrees. They don't all say exactly the same thing.
Yes, I would say yes and no to that question. In one sense, they are all saying the same thing, is that we're all projecting a very, very large Labour majority, a huge number of Labour MPs backing Keir Starmer as he walks into number 10. That's what we're all saying at the minute. But of course, you're entirely correct to point out that the scale of the defeat, and particularly the scale of the number of MPs that the Conservatives will be left with, differs greatly between pollsters. Now, I think there are two main reasons for this. One is the nature of the election. This is a change election. We're anticipating big swings, huge numbers of constituencies changing hands, and that makes it very difficult for pollsters and indeed models, even as sophisticated as MRPs, to really get to grips with the extent of the change. There are very minor things that might happen here or there. You know, a few percentage points change in the vote share can suddenly take the Conservatives from 60 to 150 seats. So it's tricky to really gauge exactly how much this change is going to eat into the Conservative share. The other interesting story that I'm noticing that's differing between pollsters is what's happening with the Liberal Democrats. Some MRPs, such as ours, have the Liberal Democrats winning anything up to around 70 seats. Some have them down at 30, even with the Conservatives reduced to around 70. So I think there's an interesting story, an interesting post mortem, I guess, for a lot of us to look into whether or not we're accurately capturing what the Liberal Democrats are doing, what tactical voting is going on, if any, and how they're going to perform, particularly in the South. We're quite punchy about how we think the Lib Dems are doing. Other pollsters disagree. So post-election, there'll be a lot for us to mull over, I think.
There sure will. Patrick English, thanks for joining us today.